November 30th, 1718, Fredriksten Fortress, Norway. A Swedish soldier named Under Svensson stands inside a trench carved into the frozen soil of Norway at 2 a.m. He has spent 11 years in one form of warfare after another. He is 26 years old, yet his appearance suggests a man of 40. Around him, 80,000 Swedish troops maintain a siege against a fortress that likely cannot be captured. The conflict itself appears unwinnable, yet it continues under the command of a king who has not slept in a permanent bed for 18 years and who has never accepted the idea of enough. At roughly 9 p.m., a musket ball strikes King Charles the Phantom in the head. He dies before reaching the ground. Almost instantly, the war comes to a halt, not because Sweden has suffered a battlefield defeat. The army remains intact. The soldiers still carry their weapons. Defensive positions are still secure. The fighting ends because the king had become the war's entire rationale. He was its only source of momentum, its sole strategist, and the only person making the decisions. Then comes the silence. In that silence, Swedish officers and government officials arrive at the same question at nearly the same moment. What exactly had they been doing, and what had it cost? The answer is severe. Sweden had been engaged in continuous war for 18 years. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were gone. Finland was drained of strength. The treasury had long since run dry. Karl, though, kept military operations alive through increasingly desperate methods. Coinage was debased. Food and horses were seized from civilians. Future income was promised again and again, even after it had already been committed elsewhere. The Swedish Empire that once dominated the Baltic Rim had reached its end. The issue was no longer whether the empire would decline. The issue was what Sweden would become once the invoice finally arrived. Sweden, in 2025, is not fighting a war. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, beneath statistics that continue to describe conditions as healthy, a similar question is quietly emerging. What exactly have we been doing, and what does it cost? The financial breakdown of the Swedish Empire in 1718 is commonly presented as a story of military excess. That interpretation is correct. What receives less attention is the financial structure that allowed that excess to continue for so long, because that structure connects directly to Sweden's present. Karl XVIII did not fund 18 years of conflict through taxation alone. The Swedish economy, with a population of roughly 1.5 million people, could never have produced the required revenue through normal fiscal channels. Instead, the campaigns were financed through several different methods. Individually, each appeared manageable. Together, they became destructive. The first method was requisitioning. In the field, it supplied food and resources to the army without requiring cash payments, but it extracted rather than created. It consumed the economic foundation of the territories it relied upon and offered little in return. With every passing year, the populations being used for supplies became poorer and increasingly hostile. As a result, the ability to draw resources from those same regions steadily declined. Alongside this process came currency debasement. The metal content of Swedish coins was reduced as the war continued. This enabled the crown to issue a greater number of coins without obtaining additional metal. The result was a transfer of wealth from existing currency holders to the state. In practice, it operated as a hidden tax on savings. During the final years of campaigning, many Swedish merchants refused official currency altogether. Transactions increasingly shifted toward foreign money or direct exchange of goods. The third method involved borrowing against future revenue. The crown secured funds using taxes that had not yet been collected. In certain cases, it even borrowed against revenue expected from territories not yet conquered. Every such commitment created another claim on Sweden's future productive capacity. Those claims accumulated and interest caused them to grow. By November 17, 1718, the Swedish state had exhausted every available option. It had requisitioned, debased, and pledged its way through all remaining resources. The death of Karl XX did not create the financial crisis. It merely removed the political determination that had kept those mechanisms operating long after they had begun working against their own purpose. Sweden in 2025 is not seizing horses from neighboring states. Yet it has operated through a modern equivalent of those same three financial mechanisms, and the outside force capable of ending the political willingness to sustain them is already unfolding. Household debt in Sweden stands at roughly 175% of disposable income. That figure ranks among the highest in the developed world. This structure emerged across 3 decades marked by falling interest rates, climbing real estate values, and a widespread belief that Swedish property represented a dependable store of wealth whose gains would consistently exceed the borrowing costs used to acquire it. In a modern sense, this debt functioned much like the requisitioning of the Swedish Empire, only hidden from view. Rather than physically taking resources from future generations, households committed future earnings to support current spending and present housing purchases. Every mortgage represented a claim against future productive output, expanding according to the interest charged by the lending institution. The Riksbank maintained its benchmark interest rate at negative 0.5% from 2015 through 2022. The rate remained below zero, effectively rewarding borrowers for taking on debt. This became the contemporary version of currency debasement. Returns on savings, after inflation, remained negative. Money flowed away from traditional savings instruments and toward housing and stock markets. As asset values increased, many households perceived themselves as wealthier than their income levels alone would suggest. That perception supported spending patterns financed partly through borrowing rather than solely through earned income. Then came the turning point. Between 2022 and 2023, the Riksbank increased its benchmark rate from negative 0.5% to 4%. It was the most rapid tightening cycle in modern Swedish history. Housing values in Sweden dropped by approximately 15 to 20% from their peak levels. At the same time, Swedish households, most of whom carried variable rate mortgages rather than fixed rate loans, experienced rising monthly payments while food and energy costs also moved higher. Consumption that had previously been supported by negative real interest rates and appreciating assets now required support from actual income. The external shock had arrived. The question became the same one that emerged on November 30th, 1718. What would Sweden look like once the bill came due? There is another dimension that makes the comparison with 1718 more than a simple property market story. It makes the parallel structurally exact. During the era of Karl the Teens, Sweden could not easily reduce its military obligations because those obligations were not entirely voluntary. They were dictated by the strategic realities of a security environment where withdrawing from one position exposed the next position to danger. The empire operated as a network of connected commitments. Abandoning one responsibility immediately created pressure elsewhere. Sweden, in 2025, faces a comparable web of interconnected obligations. Its welfare system, among the most extensive anywhere in the world, was constructed for a demographic reality that no longer exists. The population is aging more rapidly than the labor force is expanding. The pension framework, healthcare network, and elder care system were all designed around expectations of growth within the working age population. For decades, birth rates have failed to sustain those assumptions. Immigration helped reduce part of the demographic shortfall. However, the integration expenses associated with Europe's largest refugee intake per capita between 2015 and 2018 created fiscal responsibilities that offset part of the demographic advantage. At the same time, Sweden's NATO membership, officially completed in March 2024, requires defense expenditures to rise from roughly 1.3% of GDP toward the NATO benchmark of 2%. For a nation whose welfare obligations are already placing pressure on fiscal resources, this additional defense requirement does not enter a budget with clear surplus capacity. It enters a budget where every major category of spending is already supported by a legitimate need. Meanwhile, tax revenue is increasing at a slower pace than the commitments it must finance. Sweden cannot simply dismantle its welfare state. That system remains the political foundation of Swedish society and the primary mechanism through which social cohesion has been preserved. Sweden cannot postpone its defense obligations. The conflict in Ukraine has strengthened the argument for NATO spending to the point where it cannot realistically be ignored. Nor can the country reverse its demographic trend. It also cannot recreate the low interest rate environment that once made its household debt burden manageable. Achieving that would require the Riksbank to abandon its inflation objective, or for global economic conditions to generate the kind of deflation that would justify a return to zero rates. The Sweden of Carlos faced a difficult reality. Its military responsibilities could not be abandoned, yet its financial capacity was no longer sufficient to support them. The difference was bridged through a series of tools: debasement, requisitioning, borrowing against the future. Those measures functioned for a time, then they stopped working. This is what the Age of Liberty actually looked like, because the endpoint of Sweden's present path is not necessarily collapse. It is transformation. Following 1718, Sweden entered a period historians describe as the Age of Liberty. Authority moved away from the monarchy and toward the Riksdag, the parliament. The empire was relinquished. Territories were surrendered. Military expenditures were sharply reduced. A different political leadership emerged. Commercial interests and property owners gained influence over policy, replacing the dominance of the military nobility. The transition was difficult, but it succeeded. Sweden emerged from the Age of Liberty as a nation that was smaller and less influential, yet financially sustainable. The country accepted the difference between imperial obligations and available resources. It absorbed that reality and reorganized itself around what it could genuinely support. A comparable adjustment in modern Sweden has not yet occurred in a public or official form. Instead, the political system continues to manage the gap through methods that resemble those used by Karl XV's treasury administrators. Revenue forecasts remain optimistic. Maintenance of physical infrastructure and social systems is deferred. Public messaging continues to frame each fiscal challenge as a temporary issue rather than a structural condition. Eventually, the adjustment will arrive. The Swedish political system is considerably more capable than the treasury that existed under Karl XV. Its institutions possess greater strength. Its democratic mechanisms are genuine. When a modern version of the Age of Liberty arrives, it will not be triggered by a fortress or a musket ball. It will emerge through an election cycle where the distance between committed spending and available revenue becomes too large to conceal through optimism alone. And Svensson survived the siege of Fredrikstad. During the winter of 1718 and 1719, he made the journey home across Norway and Sweden. He was one among 80,000 soldiers belonging to an army that no longer had a destination. The empire he had spent 11 years protecting had disappeared. The king who had given that empire its purpose was gone as well. What remained was Sweden, smaller, poorer, and more realistic about its place in the world than it had been in 1700. Sweden's prosperity today is real. Its institutions remain strong. Its people are educated, capable, and productive. None of those facts are in dispute. The uncertainty lies elsewhere. Can a financial model built upon negative real interest rates, household debt equal to 175% of income, and welfare commitments designed for a population that is no longer expanding continue to function? Can it absorb rising defense requirements? Can it withstand normalized interest rates? Can it manage the pressures created by an aging population? Or will it require the same kind of fundamental reorganization that became necessary in 1718? Sweden has faced such a challenge before. It has adapted before. The remaining question is whether that adjustment will be made deliberately, or whether an external shock will ultimately make the choice on its behalf. History rarely repeats itself in exactly the same form, yet it often forces nations to confront the same question. How long can commitments continue to expand when capacity no longer grows alongside them? If this story gave you a new perspective on Sweden's past and present, follow for more historical and geopolitical narratives that connect major events across centuries. And consider this final question. Was the Age of Liberty after 1718 truly a voluntary political transformation that exchanged imperial ambition for financial sustainability? And if so, does modern Sweden possess the ability to make a similar adjustment by choice? Or have the very political forces that created today's commitments made meaningful reform increasingly difficult? Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.